Hello and welcome to the Music Production Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Funk. This is the show about all things making music. And today I have a special treat. I'm very excited about today's episode. I have Gordon Raphael, who produced the Strokes. Regina Spektor worked with the Libertines. He's got a brand new book right here. I got it. The World is Going to Love This. And I'm loving the book so far. It's really exciting to hear about just that time period, the 90s into the 2000s, kind of the rock thing that came back. I'm just excited to have you. Gordon, this is a little bit of one of those like Wayne's World, we're not worthy moments for me, because I love your work and I'm thrilled to pick your brain and learn about what you do.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure. So you put a book together of all these stories.
Yeah. I've been recording bands in various studios for the last couple of decades, and invariably, every time we have a break, they want to know, hey, what was it like working with, and which microphone did you use for? And so all these stories just became kind of ingrained in me, and I thought, someday I got to write all these things down because everybody seems to ask me. And so the book was born out of the idea of get these stories out of my system once and for all.
So you don't have to tell them anymore.
Well, so more people might be able to share it too that I don't meet.
Yeah. Well, you went through some really cool times. If you start even in the days in the Seattle Northwest area, what an awesome time to be there, right?
Absolutely. Especially because what happened before that, it was such a fishing village and nobody knew about the cool music that was going on in Seattle. And then all of a sudden around 88, 89, it started to become an energy center, which, other than New York and LA, there wasn't really much going on for rock music in the US at that time. And so to watch our little town become the epicenter of a rock and roll movement was really gratifying.
It's pretty neat how and this is a theme I'm noticing a lot in the book, is how this like working together, collaborating with people helps rise everybody. The rising tides raises all ships type of thing. And it really sounds like that was the case out in Seattle, because why would anyone be there otherwise before that?
Yeah, well, even the college radio station, like they were really supportive of, even if you didn't have a record deal, instead of being all snotty about it, like, you're just some kid, we've got important records to play. They're like, oh, you play at the local club and you're kind of interesting. Come on the radio show and talk about your music. And I had the opportunity to do that. And it was like a real gold mine to be able to get on the radio and play your cassette tape that you made in your 4-track basement and talk about it like you're being, like you're an artist.
Right. Yeah. Really like dignifies your work that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it seems like that was a big thing that kind of like carries over too, just in your overall attitude, accepting people. And there was a part, and I know I'm jumping around a little bit out of excitement here, but there was a part where you talked about working with the Strokes, and you had this idea like almost to shut them down because you were the veteran in the studio. But this open-mindedness to accept what other people have to say just sounds just like the radio station situation too.
Well, if you're talking about the story, it's one of the best stories in the book where, like, I could tell that they were wary and apprehensive of working in the studio. They weren't used to it. And I guess their past experience was everybody who had a studio in New York was like a big expert, and they were young kids. And even I had that experience when I was recording my first songs in a big studio. Somebody told me that some of my ideas weren't very smart and I had to defer to them. And in one case, I tried to pull the expert card and I really got shot down because when I tried their idea, I found out that they were right. The Strokes at age 21 and 22 or something, their idea was really good. And I had to kind of become humbled to be more open-minded.
Right. There's a magic to that beginner's mindset, where you don't know in a way, and you're just kind of going by your guts and what you feel.
Yeah. Being around children shows you that all the time. Like the things that they come up with, you just, wow, that's what spontaneity and imagination, which are valued aspects in music and art, is be creative, be spontaneous, be original. And it is like a child mind, a beginner's mind that really is where that comes from.
Hmm. Have you found, as you've grown and learned, that that is something that's hard to hang on to? Or is there a way you remember or remind yourself to try those funny, weird things?
I think that very experience I told you about, where I, instead of doing a 4-track demo in my basement, I got a job. I actually got a job specifically to save money because I believed in one of my songs so much that I was going to record it in the best studio in Seattle. And the experience of spending that money and having somebody kind of talk me down. And then at the end of the day, there were some cleaner signals and there was some more normal kind of sounds, but some of the magic that I did at home for free was lost. And
Hmm.
so, I thought, if I'm going to be a producer and take other people's money to work on their things, why don't I try to make them happy and listen to their ideas instead of reenacting what that guy did to me and being the expert? Even though I've been doing this my whole life, decades and decades of working in the studio, and I know lots of experiments and tricks and techniques. It's just being really open to, this is this guy's music. It's not my music. And I want to be open to I want him to go home and smile and tell other people how much fun he had and how proud he is of his music. That becomes a big value for me.
Hmm. Yeah, I've had that feeling where you kind of, it's not yours. It gets taken away from you a little bit, and it's
Yeah.
upsetting, especially when you're so excited to get started. And you're going to do this when you're young, the first few
Yeah.
times, and then it wasn't what we meant to do. It lacked that thing
Yeah.
that sometimes it's the very thing that you think is special about what you're doing.
Well, okay, so I was this young, I was like 20 or 22 years old, and I went into this big studio, 24-track tape machine instead of four. I
Hmm.
had Since I'd had already so much experience with a 4-track, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with the extra tracks. So when he set up the drums, which was just kick, snare, and a hi-hat, I said, okay, I want 5 tracks of snare. And he looked at me, 5 tracks of snare? Come on, there's only 3 drums there. What do you want? I want to run 1 track of the snare through my Rat Distortion guitar pedal. I want one to go into a big reverb, one into a small reverb, and one that I can make a backwards reverb. And he goes, "Oh, come on, that'll never work. That's not what you do. That's what you do at home." Those are the words he used. It's the
Hmm.
kind of stuff you do in a home studio. You would never do that here in a big studio. Oh, okay. So he was showing me, and then I remember it took hours to get drum sounds, like kick, snare, and hi-hat. He had to first get a signal that sounded like a pencil and then add an EQ and it sounded almost like a drum. Nowadays, I stick like a mic in front of a kick drum and the guy hits it. Oh, that's cool. That sounds great. I wonder what they were doing charging me $40 an hour for those 3 hours to get a kick and a snare sound. It's like, whoa.
Right, right. And especially if you want to do this crazy experiment, which sounds pretty fun actually.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
it would have taken just as much time to do that.
Yeah. And it would have had a little bit of weirdness that I wanted in my music at that time.
Mm. Did you ever get to try that experiment? Something
I
like
don't
it?
think I've ever done that exact experiment, but when I was in Sky Cries Mary and I had an income and I could afford lots of my own equipment, I got a digital 8-track and I got an ASR 10 and sonic sampling keyboard so I could make different sounds on every key plus 8 tracks of recording. And then I took my DMX drum machine and I'd have like on the C key would be the fat kick drum, then there'd be one into a long reverb, then there'd be one into a truncated reverb. And so I could make these beats that just had chaos, but in a really artistic way on my
Mm.
beats. So I got to experiment and hear that stuff later when I was in control in a different situation.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. You get
Yeah.
to scratch that itch finally. Yeah, it must have been
Yeah.
really disheartening, to have that kind of deflated idea, this creative, like, I'm sure you grew up like inspired by the studio antics of so many people, like when
Mm.
like Beatles and bands that got to really play around with stuff, and now here you have your moment, and it's like, no, son, you can't do that.
Yeah, right.
Hmm. Such a shame. But what a great takeaway for you to remember that and
Yeah.
bring that into your kind of philosophy of working.
And even now, hundreds of productions later, working with bands and artists and stuff, I just did something with a guy in Leeds, UK, in a studio. And he just said, like, I'm on cloud nine listening back to the, I'm just so happy about it. And it's like, even now, when somebody says that, it's like, that's all I could ask for. You know, he walked out of the studio, he trusted me with his music, and he's happy as can be. Like, that's like, check, job done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That idea of the producer to help the artist find their vision, not
Yeah.
to necessarily force them into the kind of standard, assembly line recording style.
Yeah, or even just, oh, that's the Gordon Raphael sound. Like, oh, that's his sound. Like, just talk about my name first. In fact, I have a big complaint about a lot of modern music. I find that I don't want to be complaining this early into the thing, but I find that so much of modern music for, like, I don't know, a couple decades, it's like when the production is actually more interesting than the chord pattern or the lyrical content or the creation from the artist. When the production is like, whoa, how is he doing that crazy? What software is he using? And how are they doing that? I don't know. But you're not thinking about, like, is it really interesting when you take away the production? Is the music itself like, wow? I don't like it when the production outweighs the actual heart, core substance of the music.
Yeah, I've been talking about this lately myself and how we can overdo it, overcomplicate things, and lose sight of that idea. And kind of, and I've done it myself. You get excited about doing things to your songs, and you realize it sounds better before you touched it, and you just kind of turn everything off. But
yeah,
yeah,
but
we
sometimes
overdo it. Yeah.
Sometimes it's also like, we're the producers, we're the engineers. Sometimes we're being paid. I'm not, me personally, I don't do this, but you might be paid by a label or a corporation to take someone that doesn't really have a great song or a great voice. And with your technology and your guidance, you can make it sound like they can sing in tune. You can make it sound like they've got an interesting musical idea. But, that's kind of partially what I'm talking about.
Right. So we don't even have the actual idea yet. We're just
you haven't stepped on a brilliant idea by overdoing it. It's like you're trying to take something that's really not quite formed and making it sound sellable or playable on the radio or to help their modeling career or their TV subsidy or whatever it is that other thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's such a commodity aspect behind this and then we can just, I probably got you started by saying the phrase assembly line, but putting it on a conveyor belt there. And yeah, but I think like the acoustic guitar test or the, piano test is always a great way. If it can stand there, then
yeah. Even like the music of the 80s was really interesting because they had one monophonic synth, like Depeche Mode when they started out, and they were using like little monophonic SH1s or like Pro 1s or whatever, little synths and little drum machines. And they were making it wasn't piano, it wasn't acoustic guitar, but it was so interesting out of necessity what they were building and how they were expressing themselves over simple ideas and weird sounds. But it was so beautiful and interesting and historic.
Yeah. Do you think that's a part of it? Do we have too many toys and tools these days?
I don't think so, but I know for myself that my most creative time period of making music was either when I didn't have any equipment and I had to go to friends' houses and use theirs, or it was like I felt on fire to make music, but I didn't have all the technological tools I needed. So I would do anything to get my hands on whatever I could, borrow his guitar. I have a little video on my YouTube channel about how I made one song. And I borrowed this from this guy, this drum machine from this other, and I'm showing the guys I borrowed it from. It's very funny. But I did very well when I didn't have much. And then I did well when I had a medium amount of gear, like that 8-track and that task and that ASR 10. I made hundreds of songs. And then when I really got money to buy every single thing I dreamt of and fill studios, it became like I spent a lot more time rewiring it and dusting it and adding a new piece of equipment rather than actually being on fire to write something. That was a big lesson for me.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was going through this last night where I was recording something and one of my speakers just wasn't working. I have no idea why. And I'm on the floor, I'm reaching with wires and trying to understand and swapping wires out. And I caught myself, luckily, though, and I said, this is not the point of what I'm doing here. I'll use the headphones and just move on, And it was a lot of fun, actually. For one, I wasn't just pissed off that my stuff isn't working, but it was just a different approach. It steered me in a new direction. And yeah, I felt also kind of like determined not to let the gear win.
Good. That's great that you moved on instead of waited till the repairman sent the fuse that you needed a week later.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's still an undiagnosed problem, but
okay.
One day we'll get to the bottom. Thanks. That's part of it, though, right? I mean, that's one of the things we've signed up for in this work. I've had similar experiences though when I was like a teenager and had a 4-track cassette recorder and a guitar, a microphone. And if the drummer left the drums at the house, I was lucky I had the drums. But that was it. That was my choices, and that's what I worked with. And it forced you to be creative, and it eliminated all of those choices and all those options that I wished I had at the time, honestly. But
me too.
It is a funny thing. So I think that's something I'm picking up too with the book, is that you're kind of like, especially in those Strokes sessions for the Modern Age EP, how you really avoided doing what everyone else was doing in the music industry at that time. And for me, when that stuff came out, it was so refreshing because I think the late 90s for rock and roll just got really unexciting and bland.
Alice in Chains and Soundgarden and Nirvana were tough acts to follow. Like,
sure.
That was what's cooking the first half of that decade. And so, it was going to be tough to like come up with something after that. Although I have to say that somewhere in the middle of that decade, PJ Harvey and Jeff Buckley and Portishead really they were not from the grunge scene exactly, although Jeff was seemingly influenced a little bit after his touring during that time. But that music was so from another direction and so important for recording and for listening, I think.
Yeah, there are a few highlights, but if you were watching MTV and you were getting the kind of it didn't have a lot of life. It wasn't very inspiring. But the sound that came out with those records was incredible and really exciting. And it seems like it was almost an act of rebellion against what was going on.
Yeah, a lot of that came from them too. As I said, what do you want to do? And then they gave me the directive of like one of the first things out of like Fab's mouth was like, hey, you know what everyone else is doing? That's what we don't want to do. And that gave me a clue. At first, what is he talking about? But then, oh, okay, yeah, that's obvious. What everybody else is doing is they've just gotten Pro Tools and now they can do 64 channels of sound, and they're going to do that by God. And I was even working on productions in those days with dance producers, and they had like 3 different tambourines and 3 different kick drums. And when they'd say like, turn up tambourine 2, it would take me a few minutes to go down the track list to find the track first to turn up. It was really like that. And so the Modern Age EP was done with 8-track. I had an 8-track interface, 888 by DigiDesign. And then for the Is This It album, I borrowed another one, but I only wound up using 11 channels on the whole album. And so
Wow.
those were that's very different than what people were doing.
Hmm. And to do so much with that, just that limitation. That's really cool. 11. Wow.
Yeah. The Logic sessions look crazy because it's just like really 11 little ribbons of sound.
Hmm. Did that hit tape at all? Were you using any kind of?
The only time tape entered into the process was on probably the two albums I worked on, Room on Fire and Is This It. During the mastering process, we would give each technique a choice to be heard. Like he'd run it through his half-inch, half track or whatever that thing was he had. And then he'd also go a straight digital bounce. And then we'd all listen to it and the band would discuss and they said like, oh, listen how we like the tape one on that song. And oh no, we like the digital bounce on that song. So there was an element of bouncing the master mix to tape before it went onto the album. That's the only place where tape entered.
Right. And does that mean some of it is from tape, some of it's not?
Some of it was mastered to tape and some of it was mastered just digitally. It just was a song by song basis. And it was very interesting because what I really try to make a huge point in my book at what spectroscopic ears the boys in the band had, especially Julian, the things he could hear. So like if we put something to tape, we'd all go like, wow, listen to the bass and the kick drum just got, so big and creamy. We'd go start waxing poetic and he'd be looking really strict and really like upset. And he goes, yeah, but at the price of the hi-hat, listen, it's been squeezed out of existence by those fat bands of frequency, expanding. Now the hi-hat ratio is off. He'd be hearing the little thing that was affected negatively while we were all oohing and awing about the big thing that just got really cool.
Wow, that's interesting. Where do you think they developed that at such a young age? Like,
I don't know. I mean, I think I tried to put as many tales in everyone I can remember where Julian seeing something spectroscopically that was just blowing my mind that he could hear the difference. I think I'll just give you one more example in case you're not there yet. I think one night during Room on Fire, he was laying on the couch at like 2 a.m. Everyone was pretty much left except for me and one other person. And he had 13 empty bottles of beer. And he was just laying on the couch with his eyes closed, like just gone after a complete day of work up till 2 a.m. I was listening back to something, talking to Albert, and he goes, that hi-hat sped up just now. He's like in his like altered state, almost asleep. And he heard the one hi-hat that sped up. And I had to go back and find it and kind of move it a little gently into place. So like that kind of incredible, beyond normal sensitivity to music.
I guess that explains why they're such a tight band, right?
Yeah, and the compositions that were involved in the first couple albums, the way where they work. Yeah.
Yeah, when I first heard it, I was wondering if I was hearing a drum machine.
Right.
It's really like tight. It's not stiff or anything, but it's just like, and it's also very restrained, and I don't know any drummer that can just sit there and do that, like the straight beat that long. He doesn't play fills. He doesn't hit the crash cymbals. He's so under control with it and lets it out right when he needs to, and it has such a big impact that way.
And then I was shocked to learn even early on that he can do all those things that he can do drumming, all kinds of drumming, but that is the style, and those are the kind of patterns and attitude that is needed and required of that music. So he became that element in that music. That doesn't define his whole scope, which I was surprised because I thought, well, that's what he does, that's who he is. But that's what he does for that group.
Right. Yeah. Mark of a mature musician that knows what it calls for. Even if they can do so much more, they play what's necessary. Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about some of those drum sounds, especially on like, Is This It?
Okay.
because they're so clean, and it's such, again, it's a contrast to what was happening at the time. They're crisp
Mhm.
and clean. They sound like they could have been recorded in like a closet or something. So
Right.
small but perfect for the music, that left so much space for everything else.
Okay.
Yeah, so how does that happen? Are there like tea towels on everything, like muffling
No,
all the
there's
drums?
not details on everything. There was a lot of direction from the band themselves and from Julian as the composer. There was a lot of feedback. So when I set up the drum kit at the beginning of those sessions, I would like mic them up the way I wanted to. And I think I had four mics on the drums. And he
Hmm.
had a small kit. He had one tom, one ride cymbal, kick, snare, and hi-hat. So there's a very minimal kit compared to like other drummers I'd been recording. But I'd been working in New York for several years, and I'd heard a lot about what drummers were asking for, and I had my own ideas. And so a couple of the hardest things I ever learned in my early days of recording live bands was how do you make the kick drum cut through a band mix,
Hmm.
even when you're recording the basic tracks, and how do you make a bass sound gigantic under heavy guitars and vocal? How can you track the bass so that it sounds really huge? So when I showed them my giant kick drum that I learned how to do and was proud of, and my giant bass sound, they completely looked horrified. Like, okay, yeah, yeah, right. Okay, now why? The first question: why does the kick drum have to be so loud? I'm going, what do you mean? Like, aren't you happy that you can hear that kick drum like thunder? It's just gigantic, isn't it? You go like, turn the kick drum down, like turn
Hmm.
it down. No one ever asked me in all my years up till then to turn it down. It's always like, can we have more kick, more kick, more kick? And you're sweating because everything is maxed and you don't know how to give them more kick. And this is like right on the first day before they've even recorded something. I'm just showing them a drum sound. And it's like, hey, why does the kick drum have to be so loud? So that was like real eye opening. And then when
Hmm.
I made the drums quieter and heard it, I was like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. And I can still hear the beat, but it's not like this big show off muscle guy. It's not like
Right.
this giant guy with huge legs pounding out the beat with, it's
Hmm.
something different.
Yeah.
And similarly with the bass, I had this technique of making this giant bass sound. And the first thing that they said, I think Julian said this, was like, hey, can you take the bass out of the bass? Like, what does that even mean? Like, what to a producer? Someone says, take the bass out of the bass. Like, you're crazy. I'm a little probably ruffled when he said that. And I'm like, what? Okay, look. And I just like cut the bass frequencies out of the bass. And it's like ding, 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 like this. And they go, yeah, that's cool. And then
Hmm.
when I heard it against the smaller kick drum, I'm going, wow, that really works together. That's a real sound.
Hmm.
That's something I would not have thought of on my own, never in a million years. So the band really were shaping me and on me to do these ideas in their head.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's a testament to you too for being open-minded for that. And also for sharing the credit with them too, to say,
Hmm.
hey, like this is, I can't say that I wouldn't be tempted to be like, that was my idea, you know, but there's so much ego that goes into music and producing, and it seems like that is just not even a factor with,
Well, it's also very gratifying because however many 20 years later after I meet these guys, if I go backstage to a show like I did a couple months ago, in all the interviews I've given and all the little videos and press things I've done talking about these records, they don't ever look at me like with a little squint, like going, he claimed credit for some of our ideas, or he actually is trying to get more, bravado out of this than he actually deserved. They never would think that of me because
yeah.
I've been like, I'm pretty happy with my role in it, but my role is what it was, and I like to talk about it.
Hmm. Yeah, and that is a job of a producer, right? To
Hmm.
step in when needed and help
Yeah,
realize the ideas.
and listen in case there's some left field ideas to try.
Yeah. Um, what was your technique for getting that bass drum and those basses to sound that big? And then I'll ask you a little bit about like just what the change was.
I think I mean, by the time I think I'd had a studio, I had one studio for 2 years and then already 1 year of, so I'd had like 3 years of my own studio in New York City recording bands like on a daily level. And I had had a specific microphone, and I didn't have $1 million studio. I had this basement studio with a few really good pieces in it, like one Neve and a little Soundcraft Ghost mixing console from the late 80s
Hmm.
that was like anything that that's not the most important mic can go on that. And I had some APIs. So I knew which microphone and which preamp to use to get the best sound. And with that solid sound coming in, I could just turn it up loud on the software, which was Logic at the time, and just there it is. Like it's just like a mountain of sound, you know, and then just okay, turn the volume down, like turning the volume down on the kick drum, and then putting a filter bank EQ, and then this like carving off low frequencies off of the
Hmm.
bass. That's basically exactly what we did.
Right, and that leaves a lot of room for everything else to breathe in the mix.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
that's something that I really like about those mixes is they kind of have like sometimes when you like over compress things, you can get that like smash sound. It
Mhm.
has that with all the dynamics in
Mhm.
that it's nothing is too over the top and everything just really kind of interlocks so nicely.
I agree. I didn't use a lot of plugins on the mix of it. A lot of that sound was just like a tube compressor on the vocals or a tube compressor on the room mic. I didn't use like drum bus. I didn't know how to use buses back then.
Hmm.
I did, well, especially with 11 tracks total of the whole production. There wasn't really that need
Right.
for it. Was like each individual sound was just treated like, had to work on that track.
Hmm.
And a lot of it just had to do with getting the tone right from the guitars and the amps, and just mixing the volume automated, every moment, like, oh, he just hit that drum a little louder, turn it down a bit. So make it just leveling everything the way they wanted to hear it in the mix. It was like
Hmm.
a chess game. It took a lot of time actually to do the mix, even though it
Yeah.
was 11 tracks.
Right. But I guess there's also, you got like the two guitarists kind of trading off on leads and
Mhm.
gotta bring one in, one out a little bit, I'm sure.
Yeah, and most of that was done live, so it wasn't
Yeah.
like, okay, stop, it's time for the solo. Okay, let's punch in the solo. It was like they were just playing with the drums most of the time. So
Right.
anything that had to happen was very much like, okay, on this section, he does this sound with his fuzz box, and that drops the volume a bit. So we gotta take that whole pre-chorus and boost it so it doesn't lose energy when he switches to that sound.
Hmm. Any click track? Or is this just
Definitely. That was a big difference between, I think, the first EP, which was just supposed to be a demo, and the album. There was
hmm,
probably 4 or 5 months in between. And again, I think Fab was 20 years old at the time that we started recording that stuff. And even him, at within 4 months, he's coming to me at the beginning of recording the album and he going, I heard myself speeding up and slowing down a little bit on the EP, and I really want to make sure that doesn't happen at all. On our first album, I want everything to be really locked.
hmm,
So I want to use a click track. So he used a click track, and kept his energy. And they did sometimes many, many takes. So he's really pouring it out like for
hmm,
hours sometimes to get those basics. And sometimes it went very quickly.
hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, there is a slightly more frantic energy to that EP.
Yeah.
A little more aggressive and in a lot of ways, the vocals and but it's awesome. It's a really cool thing,
Mm.
and I think it's a nice translation too to be able to still have that, but with the I guess a little bit of a more polished approach.
Yeah, I think it's also valuable for fans and people who like those songs. Oh, this is how they did it. And sometimes it's not like one's a clear better. It's like, oh, it's so different. Like listen to that
Hmm.
solo over here, and then he changed it to that solo, or the tempo is slightly different. And I don't know. I'm glad that both examples exist and are talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. There's a really cool part I was reading when you talk about how open they are with communication, and that's, I think probably also helps that your attitude was like that too, in that everybody has a say in everything. It's not just
Yeah,
this is my part and I'm gonna be the
right.
one in charge of that.
Right. It wasn't like um, Fab would do his drum part and then he'd go to the pub across the road or to a party while someone else made it. Was like when the next guy had something to do, he might be like listening as hard to their part to make, and he'd say like, "Hey, you did it a little better at practice a couple days ago. That you can do better." And I didn't know that. So for me, it was like, wow, that's really cool.
Mm.
But because they had the extra insight of all that work they did together, they could really give each other feedback. And I think that one of the things I point out in my book about their communication was that even if they were kind of, one of them wasn't getting along with the other, or they were having a conflict, rather than one guy being passive aggressive and going to get drunk and coming and ruining the whole day by playing bad, they would just like, okay, you got an attitude, let's talk about it. What's going on? And they right in front of me, there were these young guys like doing some communication instead of the
Hmm.
typical musician, passive aggressive, codependent, not have any idea how to talk about their anger or their frustration. They were just doing it right there. And I thought this is a great example. And this is a real fine point of production, because our job is to get the best sound possible. And if the people aren't happy or they're fighting or they're not comfortable, we can't, no matter what microphone you have, you're going to get some weird stuff that's not going to be as useful as if they can just solve it and get along and get back into the groove, you know?
Right. Like every mic picks up on that energy,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
matter what you do. Yeah, I'm currently playing with some of my friends right now, and it's just such a great energy. It's because of that, the freedom to be silly, to make mistakes, to comment on each other's performances and not feel like it's commenting on you. We're
Right.
we're playing together because we like playing together. And in my case, I've over the last few years, I started playing guitar, playing in rock bands, and then got into production and some synthesizers, electronic stuff, and it became much more solo, and a more lonely pursuit. So I
Yes.
really do have this extra appreciation for getting together with people, and part of the reason it's so nice is because there's differences and because they don't see everything the way I see it.
I'm very similar. I started off playing in other people's bands. I hadn't written songs yet. And then when I started really writing and playing more guitar and keyboards and vocals, it became like very much a solo thing. And every now and then I'll get together with a group to do a tour or a concert. And if you're with the right people, they can bring their own ideas to it, and you don't have to be in control of every element all the time. Sometimes that you show them what you were doing and they do it a slightly different way that could even be cooler. And
Hmm.
so you can sometimes really gain by working with the right people.
Yeah, I completely agree. And when I was first doing it, I wanted things to be the way I heard them, the way I wanted them. And now I'm just really enjoy like, wow, I never would have done that, and maybe I would do it the other way, but this is gonna now make me do something different, and back and forth.
I kind of combine it like this. I know, like, even from a young age of writing my songs, I knew exactly what I wanted everyone to do. And if they had a slightly different idea or they had an interpretation or could add to it, I was very quick to understand when, no, my idea is better. Just keep it simple. Don't do those silly decorations on the hi-hat. But I also knew when, fuck, that picking pattern you're doing is something I could never dream of doing, and it makes my song sound better. Thank you very much. So
Hmm.
I was quick to discern between what was really boosting my song to a new high and what my idea would have been better, and just trying to get them to do that.
Yeah, you need that, right? That's a
Yeah.
that's a good skill to have.
It's the open-minded dictator.
Nice. Yeah, it is so much about that, I think. In listening to your music, which is so cool. I'm really it's in reading your book, it's caused me to go back into some of the stuff you were doing too. and it's been one of the real treats of going through the book. Your stuff has a lot of effects, a lot of times synthesizers and sound reverbs and cool like psychedelic stuff. And it is so different from, I don't even know if there is any reverb on the Strokes records when I listen to them.
Zero.
It's amazing.
The only effect is like overdrive, like their Jekyll and Hyde distortion pedals, and me saturating the preamp for the vocals. That's the only effects, and they're not really effects. They're just, tone things.
It's bold. That production is bold, if you ask me, and that it's naked. It's the vocals themselves have a really distinct sound. It's an aggressive sound, and I love the part you and this is something I wanted to ask you about too. But just this like cryptic way of discussing things. When you put the distortion on the vocals,
yes,
I'll let you tell me your story, but it's
okay.
I love this like abstract way of talking about music, and I think that's where a lot of that imagination stuff we were talking about earlier comes in.
Yeah, because probably at that time, I don't know if it's changed because I haven't worked with him, but I see him and I meet him and I talk with him, or I see him on interviews or whatever, and somehow I don't think he's changed very much. I still think when he wants to express an important idea, he's very rarely like blah, 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 straight, like logical thinking. He's always like giving an example or like giving a metaphor or creating a painting so you could like try to see how he's thinking about it. So yeah, when I first showed him my idea of what's so cool and put the distortion on 10 and just have the nuclear fry out vocal, he just looked at me like I'm a fool. Like, what is that ugly, ugly sound? But it triggered something in him, and he said, like, what? You know how your favorite jeans, like, they don't have holes in them, but they're not new? And that was the clue he gave me about what he wanted me to do from the point I started with all that distortion. And I thought, what is this crap he's saying? Like, I don't understand. Come on, I'm a producer. Tell me to put more treble, or what do you want me to do here? And then I thought, oh, wait. Maybe, in no holes would maybe dial that back a little bit, but keep the worn sound and keep it not clean, but don't quite fry it out and obliterate it. And that's the second move was the right move. Just, it took really one more try of like, you mean 4 instead of 10? Let's try that. And he loved it. He was like, yeah, exactly.
It reminded me a lot of, reading George Martin talking about John Lennon when they did the last song on Revolver, the trippy one, the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Tomorrow Never Knows.
Right. Thank you. And he said, I wanted it to sound like the Dalai Lama on a hill chanting.
Oh, wow. There you go.
George Martin's reaction was very similar to yours. Like, what? What does that even mean?
Right.
But that's a cool way to collaborate, I think, because you kind of paint this like abstract idea, and then the other people you're working with have to then interpret it.
Right. It requires patience on my part or anybody who's on the other receiving end, and it requires kind of like a little bit of sense of humor to like go with it and to try. You got to be a little bit open and off your guard.
Right. You need to just say, okay, we need to solve this puzzle.
Right. Here's the Dalai Lama preset. Let's go for it. The hill. You want the hill now? Okay.
Yeah. More hill.
Right.
That's funny. I got a sense of that too when I was watching your video about the ARP Odyssey.
Oh, thank you.
So fun watching you talk about that, like your love for that instrument. Which they've actually like re-released a version that I've
tested them.
How do you feel? Do you think it stands up?
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. It was the Korg one came out, and also my other favorite is the original Mini Moog. The original Model D Mini Moog, and Behringer came out with them, and I was like,
I have it, and I'm Can't
Well,
believe it.
I was like arms crossed. Like, what? You're telling me, my $4,000 vintage Mini Moog is supposed to be able to be emulated by a $250 knockoff by Behringer of all people? And so I watched a video of some old timer A-Bing it, and it sounded damn close to me. So I bought it because I had to travel to South America, and damn if I was going to take my creaky
Yeah.
old 1974 ARP Mini Moog. I put this thing wrapped in T-shirts in my suitcase, and I did A/B testing with my own Moog, and there was I found one filter setting that was slightly different, and every single other thing was the same. And on top of that, let's say I've used Mini Moog and ARP Odyssey since I was 16, 17 years old, all my life, decades and decades, okay? But using these new versions with a MIDI keyboard was the first time I could use LFO with all the oscillators on, because you always have to
Right.
use one of the oscillators to be the LFO, to do the vibratos, which meant you were only using 2 instead of 3 on the Mini Moog and 1 instead of 2 on the Odyssey. So the first time I put that mod wheel on and heard both oscillators on the Odyssey and all 3 on the Moog vibratoing together it was like a revelation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah, I've seen people doing that A/B with the Mini Moog, and almost like
Yeah.
they don't want to admit it, like,
Oh,
because I mean, look, the Mini Moog is impressive. It's a beautiful piece of art. It's like furniture in a way, like
yeah.
fine, and those knobs are huge and they're really fun to
Yeah.
turn.
Yeah.
But it is really amazing. Like, we are kind of spoiled these days.
Well, I spend a lot of my life watching videos of instruments. Like, oh, what did the Jupiter 8 sound like in the 80s? Some old guy showing his Jupiter 8 off. And then there's the other kind where we've got this reverb, this Bricasti reverb. Sorry, Bricasti, if you're sponsoring this podcast. And it sounds just like an EMT plate. Listen, this very trusted guy from a studio is going to show you A/B, and you listen to the Bricasti and it sounds like sterile digital nothing, and you listen to the EMT and it sounds, when you wear headphones, like ghosts are howling in the tank and weird supernatural unexpected events are happening, and you go, dude, no matter what you say, my ear can hear that this is A and B, this is night and day. But then with something like the Mini Moog and the Behringer Model D, my ears told me that, and the guy was smiling, he was like showing it A/B, and he was convinced it was true, and my ears were convinced it was true, and I went out and bought it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to be able to shell out the money for a Mini Moog anytime soon. So
sometime in the
I'm
future.
I'm super thankful that they did that. I know that I've read a lot of heat. People are upset that it's a copy, cloning. Behringer's like kind of going wild, cloning everything. But
who isn't upset that it costs like
not me.
$16,000 for a vintage Jupiter? Who's got that money to have the real one? And from owning tons of vintage gear, from preamps to compressors to synthesizers to guitars, man, you have to have a whole other hobby of either being an expert repair person or a huge budget for every year something needs a checkup or a new capacitor, a new transistor, or this. So having old equipment comes with another financial responsibility of keeping it alive.
It really is, because they are actual living things that are decaying, and just like the rest of us.
Yep.
Yeah, the descriptions you have, it's just nice to hear people talk, not in like these super technical ways, but in like how it makes us feel. You said it with the reverb plate. There's ghosts in there, and there's, there's like things going on, and I find when I'm making my music, when I can get into those zones where my sounds are almost like characters in the story, it's so much more fun, and you're less technical. You're more like the kid playing with the toys, using your imagination.
Yeah. Well, I came into composing from keyboards, Hammond organ, string machine, and synthesizer. So for me, just messing around and coming up with a sound that is unusual or unique, and you can still do that with analog synths because there's so many knobs, and a lot of them don't have computer memories. So you're just searching in the void, and you come up with this weird thing, and you go, oh, I'm going to record that and make a song out of it. That's the
Hmm.
basis of my song, was this weird discovery.
Hmm.
And then on top of that, one of the things I value that not everybody values, but for me, it's a huge value of the music I love, is improvisation. The willingness to just spontaneously start making music.
Hmm.
You don't plan the rhythm, you don't plan the tone, you don't plan the notes. Just like, you got a framework, now add a couple chaotic random elements, and that's really fun. That's a great color. A
Hmm.
random chaotic element is a great value to me.
Yeah, because we can really dial in things so much, right? We can
Mhm.
really perfect and be super intentional about things. And a lot of times that's
Mhm.
great.
Mhm.
There's obviously value in really well thought out compositions.
Right.
But a lot of times, sometimes the cool things happen when you don't really know where you're going when you start.
Right. Or even just in the middle of a great composition. That's a lot of the stuff I like. Hendrix, for example. There's a great composition going on, but all of a
Hmm.
sudden it just breaks into something. They go off into orbit,
Right.
and somehow they find their way back. It's a very jazz thing as well. They find their
Mm.
way back into the composition after a while, and you're glad they took you with you on this journey to somewhere else. It's very,
Yeah.
very fulfilling.
Yeah. To be able to do that and have the freedom, and especially with other people like that, where you can trust each other in those
Yeah.
roles, to get
Mhm.
each other there. Yeah, that's a cool aspect I'm hearing in your stuff and in the older stuff, and I think it's some newer stuff. I'm not exactly sure. I've been kind of all over the place on your YouTube, especially just
And it's really hard to
diving
tell
in.
which is my old stuff and which is my new stuff, because with digital, I could take a song that I just found on a cassette from 1979 and have it mastered and stick it up there, and it looks like it just came out in the year 2022, but it's actually the oldest thing. It's really hard to know what's what in time.
Yeah, yeah, it's a cool thing, and I think that's kind of true when you listen to the Strokes record in a way too. It kind of came out of a lot of time periods, and
Sure, sure.
you know, and also the way you're putting together your videos, you have a lot of like psychedelic references to the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
and on a few of them I've spot some gear that I'm like, okay, I get it, this is a little newer. But it takes some detective work in that line of thinking. I'm noticing, and I think this is important too for me, is the vibe of your studios and the places that you're playing. You seem to take
Sure.
a lot of care in that.
Yeah, I think that was one of the big selling factors when Albert first came to my first studio in New York. And he's, okay, we just met this guy at a gig. We don't know who he is. He says he's got a studio and he wants to record us. They sent Albert to check me out. And he walked in, and he just loved the decor. He just loved the feeling of being in that little basement studio with it, purple velvet drapes and like dim lights and old beat up amplifiers, compared to the other places they'd gone, which were like expensive corporate studios that would have been just as happy to record a cat food commercial for NBC television network than it would be to have some band pay less than the high rate to record a demo. They don't feel comfortable in a place like that, in a neon lit corporate studio, even though they might have $1 million flashy console to impress the clients. That wouldn't calm them down and make them feel secure. So
Mm.
I always thought that just the environment and the ambiance and the sound, those all have to work together.
Mm. Does that kind of studio, did that appeal to you ever? Is that,
With the corporate,
yeah, well, like the
oh
big,
no, no,
yeah,
no, 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 no.
yeah.
Even I think, for most of my life, I wouldn't even sing unless the lights were almost off or there was like colored lights or like I couldn't, how could I get into my character,
Yeah,
you know?
character, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it was a big deal too, because like in the 60s and the 70s and even in the 80s, like there was colored light, they had light color systems and projections and stuff. And then at some point it became like just stark white lights, like a white spotlight. I
Mm.
remember Bowie actually did a tour, station to station tour in 75, where he wore a white and black suit and had only white lights on stage. And it was so revolutionary. No one had ever seen something like that. It was like,
Mm.
wow, white lights on a stage with music.
Cool that one time, I guess, until it just
Sure.
becomes
Oh,
sterile
he
and
could pull it off. He could pull it
yeah,
off.
right. He had a pass to do whatever he wanted, really.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it makes a big difference. You know, I always think about like we're capturing like a moment in time. We're capturing like a feeling.
Mhm.
And it's kind of ironic that sometimes in order to like do that, you go to these like really clinical environments.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of time in a clinical environment, you'll got a clinician who gets clinical sounds as well.
Mm,
You know, they're not going to be like relaxed and let you get whatever sound you want. They're going to be like, this is like our $1 million studio. Hey, careful with that board. Don't, we can't push it that hard. And, don't put that mic so close to the drum. It's, you don't know how expensive those ribbons are. You're made to feel a little bit like being bossed around and
mm,
uncomfortable in an environment like that.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Don't touch. Don't touch.
Hmm.
I do. I'm a high school English teacher by day, and then do all my music in the nighttime. But at school, I do a music production club, and we have Ableton pushes that we use,
Mhm.
and it's funny, like with kids, right? Like these high school kids, and when you give that to them, their initial training, all the parents and adults that have told them not to touch are in their head and they're like afraid to touch it. And they're like
Right.
scared.
Wow.
And because this is like, we're doing something like important and
Yeah.
professional. And, and they're always amazed when I'm like, go ahead. Like you have to actually hit the pads, like
Yeah.
beat them. they're sensitive to touch. So hit them hard. And like,
Right.
look, the thing is called push. It's meant to be touched. And to see it like open up, what happens to them creatively from that is huge.
Sure. It's really hands-on.
Yeah, it is literally hands on,
Uh-huh.
but it opens like a creativity. I know for me, even in my playing, if I'm using someone else's guitar and it's like, and they don't really want me touching it, like I'm
Right.
not gonna play well on it.
No.
Nothing good's gonna come out of that.
But if they let you take it home and you
Mhm.
got it all by yourself and they trust you and you can mess around with it, it could be really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that freedom to get to that point where you need to be. Like you said, get into character.
Hmm.
I'm often thinking about that when I'm singing my songs. I'm some character, which can
Hmm.
make it really frustrating or maddening when people try to analyze what you're saying too much. It's
Hmm.
like it's not me.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it's when you can get in those moments. If I'm not there, it's just falls flat. It doesn't have that
Right.
life.
Right. And when you get into some people say the zone. For me, it was like going into a whole another world. This is the world of music,
Hmm.
and I want to be in that world. I want to open the door and see what I can discover up there and what I can bring. The recording is like capturing something from the world of music. So it's not in your mind and it's not in the imagination. It's really right there on this cassette in your hand that you can play for your friends,
Hmm.
you know, and that's a huge thing.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. I express that to students I work with that you're trying to create a world.
Hmm.
You're giving the listener a place, a feeling, some place to go. And I do find in our modern recording equipment can be so clean and sterile sometimes where
Mhm.
You know, if you don't have a track moving across your screen, it's literal dead silence. Infinite,
Mhm.
negative infinity dB, you know.
Sure. Right.
Totally unnatural, just doesn't exist anywhere in the world.
Right. Well, that's why you can't like cut a track when there's dead space because you can hear the
Uh-huh.
hiss and the wind go away sometimes, and it's a shock.
Yeah, yeah. It's like all of a sudden we're not there anymore. Like
Right.
the it's been lifted from you. You're in the UK now, right?
Yeah, I'm in
And
the northwest, in West Yorkshire, near Leeds and Manchester.
mhm. Nice. So,
Mhm.
when you're doing your work nowadays, is it similar in style? Those kind of vibes you're trying to create?
The big difference is that ever since I think I had a studio in London when I lived there after New York, and I had a little studio in Berlin. But mostly, what's changed in the past couple of decades is either I go to a town and use a studio, so I'm always using someone else's studio,
Hmm.
or there's a couple studios near me. If a band wants to record, I take them to a studio in Leeds. And I always check out ahead of time, like what's it look like? What are the people like who I'm talking to? What gear is there? And usually there's lots of studios. I've had a good time in many, many, many kinds of studios around the world. So it's
Mm.
nice to know that the values of having some good equipment in a place that's comfortable to work and has good results and it's functional is a universal thing. It's everywhere in every town.
Mm. Yeah, that's nice. And I guess
Hmm.
brings you back to that experience of, using other people's stuff. Um,
Hmm.
I read the part where you had the fire,
Oh
losing the
yeah.
gear,
Yes.
must have been traumatic, but it gave
It
you,
was.
yeah, it gave you that just like incentive to go out into new territory.
Yeah, I was so into music and suddenly all my tools were gone and I had to like, okay, where am I going to get something that I could play? Where can I write my next song? And so
Mm.
I reached out and I went from Seattle to New York the first time because of that, because someone said, "Oh, we're really sorry to hear what happened to you. Come over to our studio and you can use our gear to write your song." Okay, I'm there.
Mm.
I wasn't going to let the momentum stop.
Right. Well, that's a great thing, because I think a lot of people might have said, you know, that kind of loss can do that to a person.
It was devastating, but at the same time, it kicked my ass to like next. What are you gonna try? You got to do something.
Mm. Hmm. Very cool. I'm definitely glad you did.
Thanks.
It's definitely benefited the world quite a bit. The world does love it, to quote or rearrange your title a little bit of your book.
Right.
Um, what is it like now with a book, being like a writer and author now? Has
Well,
that changed your life at all?
I have a very strange career. All my life, I felt like there's people that are super successful, and I want to be like that. But it was never like I was always like kind of just struggling on my own as a musician. Like nobody really knew my music, and but I thought it was good. And then as a producer, sure, I recorded the Strokes. Is this it? Did any record labels ever call me to record bands? Did managers of big bands say, "This guy's so cool, listen to it"? No. But kids started calling me, like these young musicians. We love those albums, dude. Come to Brazil, come to Montana. So I have this strange little pathway through music that's not in the super limelight. I don't drive a Mercedes Benz and, have a huge bank account, but I'm working all the time and I get a lot of gratitude for music I've produced or working with bands, just one on one, personal good vibes because I'm taking them seriously. And now I have this book out in the world and I'm on an independent publisher. So I don't have a New York Times ad and people generally don't know about the book, but I do little promotions on my social media and little by little people are finding it around the world and writing to me that, oh, they're so happy to know these stories and they feel like they're in the studio with me and the Strokes, or they love my description of how to write music or how to treat bands. And I'm getting a lot of beautiful feedback. and it's very gratifying and makes me feel great. Puts a big smile on my face every time I get a little inbox message on Instagram saying like, "Dude, your book, it's really, really great." Like I love that.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I think that's like a real there's a lot of genuine authenticity to that. You know, that kind of appreciation for your work. Um, you know, I don't know. I guess maybe the record companies weren't willing to take that chance, you know, but I think it's just so cool that it broke through the way it did. And
Yeah.
you know, as for someone like me too, it was, you know, when that stuff came out, it was just the best. It was so refreshing. Like you almost were like afraid rock and roll was going away, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it had just become too corporate and clean, and it was upsetting, you know. And I guess in a lot of ways that's what happened in the early 90s in the Seattle scene. And I
Mhm.
think there's a cool thread, you know, to learn that about you through reading this book. Is it's such a great story that you came from that and
Mhm.
carried it through and still doing it.
It's a good feeling. Yeah,
And, and
definitely.
and there's so much information about how to do all this stuff right in the studio, you know, right, the proper way.
Yeah.
And your book is so great because I don't wonder about like how they recorded, you know, all these like clean, polished rock albums. I want to like, how did they get that sound on this? Is this it? You know, how did that happen? Why that? Why is this going on here? So to have that in words, and then also just the stories too of, you know,
Yeah.
seeing how the things in your life connected and the unexpected results and surprises along the way. It is a great story, and I can totally understand why a lot of people have encouraged you to put it into words.
Thanks. And it was really interesting because I wanted to talk about microphones and compressors and I wanted to talk about the studios, but I thought, there's a way to do that where nobody or most people in the world will not have any idea what I'm talking about and they'll completely glaze over. And there's a way to talk about it, like to show the passion and the excitement of the sound and how we came up with innovation using these old German microphones and things like the Beatles used and this and that. So it was fun weaving a little bit about production and technology and actual the nuts and bolts of my job in a story that's like about rock and roll and about some of your favorite musicians and how they were talking and what they looked like and what they thought.
Hmm.
It was fun trying to get that balance correct.
Yeah, and you're kind of unapologetic about either. You know, you're happy to go right into the detail, the gear, and you're happy to go right into the narrative of the time.
Talking about the German history of Logic software.
Right. Are you still a Logic user?
I use Logic whenever I want to use soft synthesizer or soft MIDI, anything to deal with MIDI. I want to use Logic, but there's a couple reasons why Pro Tools is a really preferred way for recording 19 microphones and a band and a singer, especially singers. I
Mm-hmm.
find that thing that Logic does where when you record a little overdub of a word and it opens up a little ribbon underneath, like that's just too many button pushes where Pro Tools, I could either accept it and crossfade it. I don't have to go into another lane and do some movements just to get a word in a
Right.
track.
Mm-hmm.
So I love the speed and the convenience of Pro Tools for working with a band and working with live musicians.
Right. Gotcha.
Mhm.
Yeah, when I first got a computer to record music, all I knew was Pro Tools, so that's what I got.
Right.
And I spent a little time in there. I was mostly working against Pro Tools though to make my music,
Uh,
you know,
because
as I
of
was
MIDI
learning.
or because of MIDI or what?
No, I wasn't. I didn't even know what MIDI was at that point.
Okay. Okay.
I was doing just straight. It was just I didn't know how to use the software really.
Right. Right.
I wound up in Logic. But that was by the time Apple had it.
Mhm.
Um, and now I'm Ableton Live. I find it's such a great songwriting tool, and I think from what I can gather, Pro Tools seems really good from like the engineer perspective and in the studio. And
Mhm.
I see Ableton Live as like my songwriting partner.
Yeah, I think there's huge difference, like FL Studio,
Hmm.
Ableton, Logic, and there's huge differences of what they do. And that thing I was talking about, like five guys have given me a bunch of money to record something that they've rehearsed for a year, and I need to do it quick, and I need to do it like so they don't even know. They don't. I don't want them to be aware of the technology or the process of recording. I want them to play their song like they're in a practice or like they're at a show because that's where they know that.
Right.
So Pro Tools lets me be completely invisible and fast behind the scenes, but I wouldn't want to like compose with it. I wouldn't want to compose with it and do MIDI sequencing and
Mm.
control keyboards. They're very. It's not cool for that. I
Hmm.
think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of the sense I had too. And I don't, I'm not recording bands like that, so
Mhm.
it's mostly my own stuff and my friends. Um, did you ever think about doing an audio version of this book? I mean, talking to you is really fun, and I'm going to be reading it so much different now, like hearing your voice and your
Yeah.
own enthusiasm. I can hear it in the words I've already read, so I
I
would
have an
love to hear that.
offer. I have an offer to do like there's a company that wants me to do an audiobook and my publisher is excited for me to do an audiobook, but in a way, like I want to do it myself. And I'm not sure, like with my sounds, I'm not sure if the company they want to probably really clean. There's scientific thresholds of they want this ratio of noise to background noise, and they're really into the technology and be like I don't even know some of the meter readings they were asking me for. I never even heard of before because we
Mm,
don't use it in rock and roll.
right.
And also the thought of just, it took me a long time to write, actually short time to write the book, probably like a couple months, and then a year to edit it. I did it over and over it because it was just what I thought was a great book was just a lot of run-on sentences and 1,000 extra commas. And so four edits later, it became like something that people could read. And the idea of going back into it and reading it page by page, it's a little bit daunting for me, but I know I should do it,
Yeah.
before some actor does it and mispronounces all my friends' names.
I can understand that. It would,
A
to sit there and read it must be daunting. And yeah,
little bit.
you might want to run it through that preamp on 10.
Yeah. I want to use my vintage Neve and a Neumann microphone and get a little bit of saturation.
Yeah, right. Did you have any kind of process to stay disciplined through this? Because that's a pretty quick time to write a book. And,
Hmm.
editing, of course, is a big deal, but
I've
that's
really
impressive.
wanted to write. I've wanted to write a couple books. This was one of the books, one of two books I thought I wanted to write, and I've been having this idea for a long, long time. But I never thought I'd do it because I'm not the kind of guy that likes to sit down. If I have a free moment where I'm not working on a project, I like to walk around a city and just look at people and drink coffee and look at record shop. I love going
Mm.
out and doing little stuff like that. I don't want, I just finished a project. I've got 2 weeks off or a month off. Now I'm going to go up in my room and sit down and write. Like that just
Yeah,
seems so like I just didn't think I'd ever do it. And then lockdown came around. I
there
had
you
to stay
go.
home. I couldn't
Hmm.
go traveling to Berlin to record bands. I couldn't go out. I couldn't even go to the next town. I had to stay home.
Hmm.
So this little voice just said, "What about the book? You're sitting down anyway. What about the book?" And as soon as I just came up with that idea, I just started. Where do you start a book? Oh, I'm drinking coffee at my favorite cafe in New York, wondering what I'm going to do because I just moved there and I don't have any job. And okay, write that. And then what happened? Oh, I got a studio and my band. But then it just all unfolded quite easily. One of the things that took the longest was I wanted to make sure that my stories were correct in order. Like, what happened? Did I meet them first, or was that show first and then they got signed? And there's a website, setlist.fm. I discovered that I wanted like Strokes show, Luna Lounge, like just, and this website has every band, like hundreds and thousands of bands, and every show they've ever played and their set list with the date of the set list. So I
Wow.
was able to do online research to find out where was I in June of 2001. Was I in Europe or was I in America? Oh, that was in New York. So
Wow.
I got to use some internet research to find out where I was when.
That is cool.
Yeah, it
A
was
little
great.
detective work for your own life.
And it wasn't even mentioning me. It was just mentioning these bands that I remember meeting
Hmm.
or seeing, and I just wanted to find out when it was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fun part for me in reading this book too. I mean, I know all these places. I'm on Long Island. I've
All
played
right.
many of them myself, and just, the history of New York is just amazing. It never
It's
ends.
incredible.
You're always surprised.
Mhm. I'm glad I was born in New York.
Yeah. Yep, good place to be. And
Yeah,
it's also nice to get out of sometimes too.
sure. Sure.
Cool. Well, hey, that's a good thing to come out of the pandemic then, right? A silver lining.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That, and I got so much work, like all of a sudden work started pouring in. And what was it? I wasn't going to studios anymore, but everybody was recording and sending me things to mix.
Hmm.
And that was really fun because when I record a band, I'm only working with them for 2 weeks, you know? And when I'm mixing, while I'm sending band A's track to Chicago for them to talk amongst themselves and get back with feedback, this other band from Berlin or wherever was sending me another track to work on. So it was like I could work on 3 or 4 projects at the same time. And
Hmm.
that was really challenging and fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that is cool. You like to do a lot of mixing as you go, from what I read.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm producing something,
Yeah.
it's clearly laid out in the book that I have this philosophy. If I'm going to sing on one of my own songs and I'm doing all the work, if the drums are not loud enough or if my voice isn't the right exact sound, it's going to be a lame performance. I'm not going to feel very
Mm.
supported and I'm not
Yeah.
going to feel like Superman. But if I have the mix perfect in my headphones and I have the coolest voice sound in the world in my microphone, well, I'm just going to be able to forget what I'm doing and just listen to the music and make a vocal that comes from some other place.
Right.
And so I do that for all the bands I work with. From the moment they're out there playing, I'm crafting the mix in the studio while they're playing the song. I'm adding EQ to the kick drum and I'm panning things and I'm noticing what microphone I should turn up for the next take, and that way when it comes time for the overdubs, then because the mix is so good already from the beginning, they add a part and they quickly know, no, that's a bad idea. No, we don't like that idea. Instead of it being like 10 potential ideas on the track that I have to now wade through later when it comes
Mm.
time to mix for hours. Does this a good idea? Is this a bad? No, everything's made a decision on the spot. And if they don't smile when they hear it, it just gets jettisoned out of the project. So
Mm.
there's never anything laying around, an old take, a possible other lyric, unless they request specially, like maybe keep that ending and this ending, and later we'll decide. But it's nice to just keep it right all the way through.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know I do that myself. It's nice to sing off the effect. Like you said,
Yeah,
you get
yeah,
into it more and you can feel it.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a couple schools of thought on that, but that's a cool way to look at it too, cuz that's got to be a nightmare too when you've got like all this extra stuff on the cutting room floor and trying to, and really whether it stays or not is going to depend on how you mix it anyway, I'm sure. So,
A lot of techniques come from an old school music industry design where the engineer and the producer are being paid this giant rate by the day, so it behooves to take as long as possible. That's why you spend a half a day setting up a drum sound, because the longer you take, and the band doesn't care because they're being paid to be in the studio and they got huge budgets. And so it's great to have like option A's over here, option B, and we could spend a year making this record. But nowadays, when a band is 6 people in the band are using their work money to hire me for 9 days to make an 11-song album and mix it, there's not luxurious time for later deciding which microphone would have been the right one for the guitar cabinet of the 5 we recorded. No, I already picked 2. They love it. When they love it and I love it, it's the right thing. And so it's kind of like a bit of a destructive. You throw that away, but it's also
yeah.
very time saving, energy saving, and has a great result.
Right. Yeah. Because nowadays we can undo everything. We can swap things out. You can,
Right.
that I get stuck there a lot in my own work, even knowing better, I'd get stuck. So when I'm, like you said, destructive, I just commit it to audio. That MIDI is now audio. You can't change it.
Right.
Tough.
Sure.
That's the preset. It lays the groundwork for everything that needs to come next.
Right.
Instead of maybe we could switch that thing from 5 steps ago, and then have to do the
Yeah.
next 4 steps again. That's cool. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk. I'm really thankful that you put this into the book. I'm loving it, enjoying it very much, and I think anyone that's into, if you're just in, this is the kind of thing too, right? Like if you love this music, it's a real treat. But I mean, it's like any music documentary you watch. You don't even have to like the music half the time, and you'll enjoy it. But there's so many good stories. There's so much stuff about the actual recording process that's really interesting. It's a gift you've given us all, and I thank you for it.
Thank you for seeing it that way.
Yeah, and thanks for taking the time. Is there any place you'd like to send people to check out your work in particular?
These days, I just got a link tree thing where it sends people to 20 different places to buy the book. That's one of my things I'm really pushing right now. I have an Instagram and I have a Gordotronic website. It's called Gordotronic because that's one of my nicknames from like high school.
Cool.
My love of synthesizers. And that thing's so convoluted and it's filled with everything I've ever done, like my artwork, photography, poetry, music, you name articles, interviews, stories about weird friends. So I like sending people there, but I don't blame them if they feel overwhelmed by its delicate complexity.
It's a fun site. It's got a kind of throwback internet feel, and it's just, you're right. There's a lot. I got lost in there for a little while myself, but it was a fun lost.
I mean, the modern internet feeling is like one page that's mostly blank that looks really super designed out with quick links to where you find it on Spotify and buy tickets and our YouTube channel and our Instagram handle. And mine instead is like a museum of everything I ever did.
It's nice. It's refreshing. I spent a lot of time on it, and I have a long way to go.
Thanks.
Well, cool. So we'll have people go to Gordotronic. I'm going to put all this in the show notes. There's some cool stuff on YouTube and Instagram, of course, and the book. The world is going to love this.
Yes.
I got mine off Amazon, so that's one place among many, I'm sure.
Totally legitimate.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Gordon, for taking the time. It was a real treat talking to you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening.